There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to people who have seen something they cannot prove and cannot unsee. It is not the loneliness of isolation or of social failure. It is the loneliness of having knowledge that the world has decided to treat as madness, of watching the years pass and the story remain unchanged while the world that rejected it slowly, incrementally, and without apology begins to move toward the position you were crucified for holding decades earlier. Bob Lazar has lived inside that loneliness for more than 35 years. He is in his 60s now, the intense young man with a jet car and the Nevada desert stories having given way to someone considerably more weathered, more measured, more aware that the time available to him for saying what he needs to say is not unlimited. And so he is saying it. Not with the urgent desperation of someone trying to convince a world that has stopped listening, but with the particular calm of someone who has decided that the record should be complete before he is no longer in a position to complete it. What Bob Lazar says he saw inside a facility buried in the Nevada desert at the end of the 1980s is not something that gets easier to evaluate with the passage of time. If anything, time has made it more complicated, because the world around his story has shifted in ways that nobody in 1989 could have predicted, and the shift has removed some of the comfortable certainties that allowed people to dismiss him quickly. The government he accused of hiding extraterrestrial technology now openly acknowledges that objects of unknown origin and capability are regularly observed by military pilots. The element he named as the fuel source for those objects, an element that did not exist on the periodic table when he named it, was synthesized in a laboratory 14 years later. The documentation he preserved from his time at the facility he describes continues to resist the simple explanation that a man manufacturing a story would have been capable of manufacturing it. None of this proves he is telling the truth. But it makes the comfortable dismissal considerably less comfortable than it was, and Bob Lazar is old enough now to find a certain quiet satisfaction in that. The life that preceded his public testimony matters enormously to understanding what the testimony is actually worth, because the character and the history of a witness are never separate from the credibility of what they witness. Robert Scott Lazar grew up in Coral Gables, Florida, in the late 1950s and 1960s, and the thing that distinguished him from other intelligent children in his neighborhood was not the breadth of his curiosity but its specific and obsessive depth. He was not interested in understanding many things at a general level. He was interested in understanding specific things completely, and the things he was most interested in were the things that moved, the things that produced thrust and velocity and could be made to leave the ground against gravity's insistence that they should not. He built rockets as a teenager, not models from kits but actual functional devices that he loaded with propellant he had researched and measured himself. He built jet engines. He learned to weld and machine and fabricate from raw materials the components that his designs required. He was the kind of young person whose relationship to physics was not academic but physical, someone for whom the equations were only interesting insofar as they described something he could build and test and modify when it failed. That orientation, the orientation of an experimentalist rather than a theorist, the kind of mind that needs to hold the thing in its hands to fully understand it, is a specific kind of intelligence that is different from book learning and more difficult to fake, because the evidence of it is not in credentials but in working machines that demonstrate the principles they embody. By the time he made his way to California and began the educational and professional journey that would eventually take him to the Nevada desert, Lazar had developed a reputation among people who encountered him for exactly this quality of hands-on technical capability. He built a jet-powered car that could reach speeds that alarmed law enforcement. He built a jet-powered bicycle that he rode on public streets. These were not theoretical exercises. They were demonstrations of someone who understood the principles governing high-speed propulsion at a level that permitted him to engineer functional expressions of those principles from scratch. This is the foundation on which his later claims about understanding an alien propulsion system rest, not just that he encountered the technology but that he had the specific kind of mind capable of engaging with it at the level of mechanism rather than mere observation. The questions about his educational credentials have dogged him since the moment he went public, and they deserve honest engagement rather than either dismissal or uncritical acceptance of his explanation. He claimed a master's degree in electronic technology from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a master's degree in physics from the California Institute of Technology. Both institutions, when asked, stated that they had no record of his attendance. This is the factual core of the credential controversy, and it is not trivial, because the absence of these records would, in any ordinary circumstance, constitute strong evidence that the claimed credentials were fabricated. Lazar's response has been consistent across decades. He says the records were removed, that the same machinery of government secrecy that erased his employment records at the facility he worked at was capable of and in fact did erase his academic records as well, and that this removal was part of the comprehensive effort to eliminate any official trail connecting him to the work he was doing. The critics note correctly that this explanation is conveniently unfalsifiable, that a man who claims his records were erased by the government cannot be disproved by the absence of records. What cannot be so easily dismissed is the parallel documentary trail that places him in proximity to legitimate scientific institutions and personnel without relying on the contested credentials at all. The 1982 telephone directory for Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, one of the most consequential scientific institutions in American history and the birthplace of the nuclear age, lists a Robert Lazar among its staff as a technician. This directory is not a document Lazar could have produced. It is an internal record of a federal research facility, and its listing of his name places him physically within one of the most tightly controlled scientific environments in the country during the years before his public testimony. In the same year, the Los Alamos Monitor, the local newspaper serving the community around the laboratory, ran a feature story that included a photograph of Lazar and identified him as a physicist working at the facility. These two pieces of documentary evidence, the internal directory and the newspaper article, exist independently of anything Lazar has claimed about himself, and they establish a prior professional connection to serious scientific work that the institutions later denied. Los Alamos itself, when the controversy erupted, eventually issued denials of his employment. How a man appears in a laboratory's own internal telephone directory and is described as a physicist in the local newspaper and then vanishes from the official employment record of that institution is a question that the straightforward fraud theory does not cleanly answer. A man can fabricate credentials he never earned. He cannot easily fabricate a listing in an internal document of a federal research facility or plant a feature story in a regional newspaper from years before he became a public figure. The disconnect between the documentary evidence of his presence and the institutional denials of that presence is one of the genuinely unresolved threads in this story, and it remains unresolved not because nobody has looked at it carefully but because the examination has not produced a clean explanation in either direction. The phone call that Lazar says changed everything came from a voice he recognized from their single brief prior encounter, a voice with a heavy European accent belonging to one of the most celebrated and controversial scientists of the 20th century. Edward Teller, the physicist whose work on thermonuclear weapons had made him simultaneously one of the most powerful figures in American defense science and one of the most contested figures in the broader scientific community, called Lazar and told him there was work available if he was interested. Lazar says the two had met briefly at Los Alamos, a chance encounter of the kind that is difficult to verify and equally difficult to fabricate convincingly, because the details Lazar provides about it are specific and mundane in the way that real memories tend to be rather than constructed ones. What followed the phone call was the bureaucratic machinery of extreme secrecy, described by Lazar with a texture of tedium and paranoia that feels authentic in ways that a dramatized account of entering a secret government program probably would not. The stacks of non-disclosure documents. The fingerprinting. The interviews that felt less like job interviews and more like interrogations designed to assess how much a person could withstand before they broke. The instruction to travel to Las Vegas, a city with no obvious connection to classified aerospace research, and to wait there for transport to a location he could not be told about in advance. The bus with blacked-out windows. The armed escorts whose manner communicated without words that curiosity was not a quality that would serve anyone well in this environment. The facility he calls S4, located according to his description approximately 15 miles south of the more famous Area 51 at Groom Lake, is a place he describes as engineered for invisibility at every scale. Built directly into the base of a mountain, with hangar doors that were sloped and textured and painted to match the natural rock face so that aerial observation would reveal nothing but mountain. The design principle was not security through guards and fences, though those were present too, but security through non-existence, the creation of a facility that simply could not be seen to exist by anyone who did not already know it was there. His first day inside that facility, his first look at what it contained, is the moment that divides his life in his own telling and that divides the people who hear his testimony into those who find it credible and those who find it impossible. What he saw was a disc, approximately 40 feet in diameter, resting on the hangar floor, made of a material that his trained eye for aircraft construction immediately registered as unlike anything he had encountered in conventional aerospace work. Not riveted, not welded, not assembled from components in any way that he could identify. The surface appeared to have been formed as a single continuous piece, seamless, curving from edge to edge without joint or fastener, with a quality of finish that suggested something other than manufacturing in any sense he recognized. His initial assumption was the rational one. He assumed he was looking at a classified American prototype, the next generation of black-budget aerospace technology built by human hands in a facility so secret that almost nobody knew it existed. The assumption held for a short time. It stopped holding when he began reading the briefing documents that had been prepared for the staff working on what they called the Sport model, a nickname that reflected the craft's relatively low, sleek profile compared to the other objects documented in the same files. The documents described not one craft but nine distinct objects of varying size and configuration, all catalogued and photographed with the flat documentary language of government record-keeping. The documents stated plainly, in the passive institutional voice of official reports, that these objects were of extraterrestrial origin. Some had been recovered from what the papers described as retrieval operations. The language did not elaborate on what retrieval meant or where the recoveries had occurred. It simply established, in the bureaucratic tone that governments use for things they have processed past the point of astonishment, that the objects in question had not been made by human beings. The propulsion system was his assignment, and his description of it is the part of his testimony that has generated the most sustained technical discussion in the decades since he gave it. At the center of the craft sat a reactor of roughly basketball size. The fuel for that reactor was an element he called 115 on the periodic table, a designation that in 1989 corresponded to nothing that existed in any laboratory on Earth. The process he described involved bombarding this element with protons, causing it to transmute into element 116, which in the instant of its creation would release antimatter. The antimatter, guided into contact with ordinary matter in the reactor, would produce an energy release on a scale that made nuclear fission look modest. That energy powered not conventional thrust but gravity wave amplifiers, 3 of them arranged around the lower structure of the craft, which could bend the local geometry of spacetime in the direction of intended travel. The disk did not push through air the way an aircraft does. It warped the space ahead of it and fell into the distortion, which explained the apparent violations of inertia that witnesses described in unidentified aerial phenomena, the instant right-angle turns, the acceleration from hover to hypersonic speed without any visible exhaust or propulsive mechanism. In 1989, the scientific community's response to this description was not engagement but dismissal, because element 115 did not exist and gravity wave propulsion was not within the theoretical framework that mainstream physics acknowledged as possible. The dismissal was comfortable because the factual anchor of the claim, the element itself, was absent from reality. Then in 2003, scientists at a laboratory in Russia synthesized element 115 for the first time. In 2016, the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry formally recognized and named it Moscovium. The element Bob Lazar had described as the fuel source for extraterrestrial propulsion technology 14 years before it was created in a laboratory now exists on the periodic table where he said it belonged. His supporters described this as the most significant piece of evidence in his entire case, the demonstration of knowledge that nobody manufacturing a story in 1989 could have arrived at by guessing. The element he named was not a logical extrapolation from known chemistry. It was a specific prediction that turned out to be correct in a domain where correct specific predictions of non-existent elements are extraordinarily rare. His critics respond that the general region of the periodic table where super-heavy elements were expected to appear was known to theoretical chemists, and that naming a number in that region was not necessarily the same as possessing insider knowledge. The debate continues exactly where it has always been, with both positions containing genuine merit and neither one producing the conclusive resolution that would end the argument. The physical evidence he kept from his time at the facility forms a documentary thread that has proven more durable than his critics anticipated. A W-2 tax form issued by the Department of Naval Intelligence covering the period he claimed to be working at S4 was among the papers he preserved, and it places him on the payroll of a military intelligence organization for exactly the time he described. The tax form is not something a fraud typically preserves from an experience he invented, both because it requires genuine employment to generate and because its specificity makes it a verifiable document rather than a claimed memory. The 1982 photograph at Los Alamos showing him beside a particle accelerator, the internal phone directory, the newspaper feature article, these pieces of documentary evidence do not by themselves confirm that he saw what he says he saw inside S4. But they establish a prior professional history in legitimate scientific contexts that contradicts the portrait of him as a man with no genuine scientific background who invented a story from nothing. The consequences he suffered for going public were real and specific and of the kind that genuine whistleblowers typically experience and careful frauds typically avoid. His home was broken into under circumstances that suggested professional rather than opportunistic intrusion. His car was shot at on a Nevada highway. Threats arrived in forms he took seriously enough to change his behavior and his living arrangements. Years later, federal agents raided his scientific supply business and removed materials that he believes they were searching for because of their connection to the element at the center of his story. These events do not prove his testimony is truthful, but they are inconsistent with the profile of a man manufacturing a story for attention, because attention-seeking frauds generally benefit from publicity rather than experiencing the specific negative consequences that Lazar has documented across decades. The friends he brought to the Nevada desert on Wednesday evenings in 1989 to watch what he told them were test flights of the craft he was working on have maintained their accounts for more than 30 years. They described objects rising from the desert floor south of Groom Lake, hovering in configurations that no conventional aircraft duplicates, then performing movements that violated the flight envelope of anything in the known arsenal. These witnesses had no particular incentive to maintain a consistent story across decades if the original experience was manufactured, and the consistency of their accounts across the years adds a layer of corroboration that is distinct from Lazar's own testimony. The world that Bob Lazar is now old enough to see from the perspective of someone who was there at the beginning has moved substantially toward the position he occupied when occupying it cost him nearly everything. The Pentagon's acknowledgement of unexplained aerial phenomena, the release of military sensor footage showing objects that no known technology can replicate, the congressional testimony from intelligence officials describing programs that studied retrieved materials of unknown origin, all of this has arrived in the public consciousness with the careful hedging of institutions that have spent decades denying exactly what they are now reluctantly acknowledging. Lazar watches this process with a weariness that is entirely understandable in someone who was told he was a liar for saying the same things 30 years earlier. What he wants the record to contain before it is too late to complete it is not vindication in the simple sense of being told he was right. He has lived long enough to understand that institutional acknowledgement, when it eventually comes, arrives slowly and incompletely and never quite at the level of specificity that would fully validate what was originally disclosed. What he wants the record to contain is the full account of what he says he saw and touched and understood inside that mountain facility, along with whatever documentary evidence he has preserved to anchor that account to something verifiable. He has the W-2. He has the photographs. He has the physical evidence of his presence in scientific environments that the denials cannot completely erase. He has the element he named before it was made, sitting on the periodic table in the precise location he specified. Whether that accumulation constitutes proof in the strict evidential sense is a question that each person who examines it must answer for themselves, because the question cannot be answered by the evidence alone. What can be said with confidence is that the story Bob Lazar has been telling since 1989 is not the story of a man who has been caught in contradictions or who has modified his account under pressure or who has been shown to have fabricated the specific claims that are falsifiable. It is a story that has remained internally consistent across decades, that has made at least one specific and verifiable prediction that proved correct, that is supported by documentary evidence of a kind that simple fraud does not typically generate, and that has been told at consistent personal cost to the person telling it. Before he dies, Bob Lazar wants the world to understand not just what he says he saw but what it cost him to say it, and what the decades of being called a liar for saying it eventually produced in a world that took 30 years to start catching up. That is not vindication, but it is something. It is the particular satisfaction available to someone who was present at a truth before the world was ready to receive it, and who lived long enough to watch the world, slowly and incompletely and without adequate acknowledgement of what the waiting cost, begin to arrive.